Hello everyone, welcome to a new episode of GeoSpace.
I'm your host, Mohammed Salih, and I'm delighted you are tuning into the New Regions bi-weekly podcast, where we take a closer look at the shifting landscape of Middle Eastern geopolitics. In this episode, we focus on Iraq at a critical juncture, from the ongoing US troops withdrawal to the run-up to national parliamentary elections in November to rising tensions around Iran-backed Shia armed factions. Just yesterday, the US State Department designated four such groups: Nujaba Movement, Sayyid al-Shuhada Brigades, Ansarullah al-Awfiya Movement, and Imam Ali Brigades as foreign terrorist organizations. We'll unpack the implications of all of this for Iraq's domestic politics and its evolving ties with Washington. To help us analyze these developments, I'm joined by Renad Mansour, one of the leading experts on Iraq. Renad is a senior research fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House in London, where he directs the Iraq Initiative. He also holds appointments as a senior research fellow at the American University of Iraq Soleimani and as a research fellow with the Cambridge Security Initiative at Cambridge University. In addition, he lectures on Middle East international relations at the London School of Economics. Before we begin, a quick reminder that you can find GeoSpace on the New Regions website under the Watch section, as well as on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also explore more of our coverage on Iraq and US-Iraq relations on the New Regions website. Renat, it's a real pleasure to have you on GeoSpace. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Absolutely. You were recently in Washington. How would you describe the mood there regarding relations with Iraq?
Well, in the different meetings that I had in Washington, I would say that by and large, Iraq is off of the radar when it comes to the priorities of the Trump administration. So when the focus is in international affairs, when it is on the Middle East, it's primarily dominated by Israel, Palestine, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, even, but Iraq has kind of slipped down in terms of priorities. Of course, there are some conversations around the changing, the end of Operation Inherent Resolve, OIR, and the kind of movement of US troops from Baghdad up to Erbil for the next year, and then the future of US-Iraq security relations being negotiated. But nonetheless, I would say the big takeaway from my trip was that Iraq isn't really on the radar at the moment with the senior at the senior level with the Trump administration.
Right. Let's switch to Iraq for a moment. I know that you also visit Iraq from time to time. How would you describe the mood in Iraq? I assume in Baghdad or all over Iraq, US and relations with the US are not really off of the radar.
No, of course. Since 2003, Iraqis have had to deal with and engage with the US on a number of fronts. At the moment, if we think about this post-October 7th climate, where we've seen many countries that have an axis of resistance, that have a connection to Iran, at war, whether that is, Palestine or Lebanon or Syria with regime change after the fall of Assad, or Yemen with the Houthis. Iraq has managed to stay somewhat somehow insulated. And there is a kind of recognition that, let's say there is an anxiety and a paranoia that Iraqis don't want to be back at war. For once, you have massive conflict in the Middle East again, and Iraq is not the epicenter of that conflict. And this is something that Iraqis are, of course, very concerned about. And so what that means is, how do you insulate and how do you stay clear from that? When it comes to normal, Iraqis, they have many other issues right now. While resistance and solidarity with the Palestinians is something that will always be there, from a human rights perspective, from a regional perspective as well, Iraqis, as we've seen in the last few months, are wanting more electricity, more development. They want salaries, they want livelihoods, they want a decent standard of living, and this is what they're calling for, and this is what they want heading into these elections in November, as you mentioned. So, this idea about anti-Americanism or anti-anything at the moment isn't really, again, a top priority for the common Iraqis. When it comes to the government of Iraq, certainly, and we've even seen the government of Mohammed A, Sudani, the prime minister, with significant outreach to the U.S., inviting U.S. firms, Halliburton, Exxon, Chevron, others, to come to Baghdad to invest. So the tone is not one of remove American troops when it comes, even from the Shia coordination framework, which now governs Iraq.
And why do you think that is, given the fact that Iraq and US signed an agreement in late 2023, just shortly before the October 7th attacks, for the US troops to withdraw from Iraq by the end of 2026, September 2026, in about a year exactly? Why are Iraqis, sort of now being silent on this question of withdrawal? Does this have anything to do with the internal dynamics of Iraqi politics, or with the regional turmoil and the conflict that we have seen, since October 7th?
Yeah, so I think there are two parts to answering that. From one perspective, and that is the perspective of the Iraqi government at the moment. This is, the current negotiations is about what they call normalizing relations. The idea being that this operation that American troops are present for, Operation Inherent Resolve, is pretty much completed. I mean, if you look at ISIS attacks, which is why this operation began, it's been at the lowest level ever, very minimal as a threat. That's not to say that the roots of ISIS are gone, or that this might not come back again. But from the government's perspective, this is about, do we need to have a permanent presence of this operation that doesn't seem to be doing much anyway? So how do we normalize relations? How do we have a state to state? Even when it comes to security sectors, how do we have state to state relations? Then there's, of course, the perspective of some of the more political voices from let's say, the coordination framework, or from some of the, PMF, the Popular Mobilization Forces, who, after the U.S. killing of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, the PMF leader, came out quite, vocally against the U.S. troops. And that's where this kind of these calls for removing the U.S. really were sparked, or at least made loud at that point, emboldened. But of course, since then, a lot has happened. And again, I go back to this point of Iraq is in a region which is transforming violently. And many of these groups have seen, even these groups that were protesting U.S. troops have seen what are the consequences to Hezbollah, to Assad, to even the Houthis to some extent. And so some of them are thinking, is this really the moment for us to be in this kind of wider war against the US or against Israel, when we need to focus on the local, focus on the Iraqi government? So a lot of the PMF groups that were initially calling for the US to be removed are now a bit silent on this, and they're waiting to see what happens, because the region is in flux.
Right. So there is something greater here which is at stake, I assume, given what you are saying, and that is in a way, the survival of the state, really, and the fear that if it were to be drawn into, this ongoing regional conflict, especially if there's going to be a new round of war between Israel and Iran, Iraq, might have to pay some sort of serious or, major price. So I guess from that perspective, it would make sense to see various Iraqi groups, even including the PMF groups, who were in the past very vocal about the need for the US to withdraw, to really want to, keep a low profile and not make too much of a fuss about US troops' presence. But It also brings me to another question. So, are we going to, given the current drawdown in the, presence of U.S. troops in Iraq, at least outside of the Kurdistan region that we are witnessing, are we going to really have a full withdrawal at some point between now and next year? Is it also, if you can tell us from your, meetings in Washington, is it something that folks in Washington want to pursue, given that, this administration campaign, one of its major campaign points was, ending the endless wars, and of course, what war brings back the worst memories in, American collective memory apart from Iraq, right? So wouldn't it make sense to have the Trump administration to just pull out all the troops and say, I ended the Iraq war for good?
Well, first of all, I would say that until now there isn't a clear idea of what the future of this relationship between the U.S. and Iraq will look like. How many troops will be removed? Whether, at the moment, whether moving from Baghdad to Erbil will be a permanent move or just a temporary move for the next year. So I would begin by saying there are many questions out there as to what this relationship looks like moving forward. At the same time, I think you're right that Iraq is considered to be one of those forever wars, Iraq and Afghanistan primarily, that the U.S. has been stuck in now for over 2 decades, in a way, from the perspective of Washington. And many people in Washington, including those in the Trump administration, are asking, what did we get out of this? What is our return on investment? And that's really the way that they see this, which, I think many Iraqis would have a response to. But in any case, you have a tension between those in the Trump administration that believe in this restraint, this restraint. These restrainers are those who are wary of the neoconservative movement that got America stuck into these forever wars. They don't want to be part of the conflicts of the Middle East. They're more interested in what are the opportunities, what are economic opportunities, business opportunities, but not wars and not conflicts. And so, you hear this from the vice president and other senior officials in the Trump administration that we need to restrain ourselves. At the same time, you also have small elements of the Trump administration who you could consider to be, who seem to be more like that classic neoconservative hawks. These are the ones who are the loudest when it comes to sanctioning some of the Iranian allied groups in Iraq. They're quite prominent, let's say, in Congress and other parts of the government. And these are the ones that saying we should have a troop presence somewhere in the Middle East because we need to continuously be fighting against Iran because the job is not done. And these groups believe that there needs this group in the Trump administration believes there needs to be potentially regime change in Tehran. So the point is that between these two groups, between those who have restraint and those who are hawks, the policy is not being as coherent as possible. You're seeing shades of both sides, but I would say that until now, it's actually been the restrainers who have been closer to decision making, and you've seen that, which is why Iraq isn't a high priority, and where the U.S. is looking at Iraq, it's looking at Iraq through the lens of, at least I say the Trump administration, they're asking questions about what are the economic opportunities there. Of course, the Iran factor will always be there unless there is a deal made. We know that the US president wants to make a deal with Iran in a way. So again, the tensions make it a lot murkier for us to understand what the US-Iraq relationship will look like moving forward.
But let's for a moment assume that, Washington actually decides to pull all its troops out of Iraq. It's politics, and surprising and unpredictable things can happen. If we got to that point where all U.S. troops are out of Iraq, are Iraq's security forces capable of maintaining security and stability on their own? Can they handle challenges such as ISIS, the Islamic State, or other regional threats without U.S. support?
So yeah, I mean, the first point I would make to answer your question is not to, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but I think a lot of people who are less familiar might conflate or equate Afghanistan troop withdrawal with Iraq troop withdrawal, where the Biden administration ended the war in Afghanistan, and very quickly the Taliban took over, and it's seen as, it is this massive failure of retreat. Iraq is a completely different context here. There isn't a Taliban in that way waiting to kind of fill this vacuum, because there isn't a vacuum. The American troops are very minimal. They're there for these peripheral ISIS operations, which, as I say, have become very, very minimal in the last few years. If you look at those who count the numbers of attacks would know this. And at the same time, those groups, all the different armed groups, all the different political groups are in the state. They're already governing it. So the Iraqi state has proven to be quite resilient in the last 10, 15 years, resilient to ISIS, resilient to internal protests and internal, dissent, which it has repressed. And it's moving forward in that way. Where I would say there are challenges, and we know when we speak to people in the security sector, officials in the security sector, they do have concerns, often around technical issues. Iraq wants to have more control over its airspace. Intelligence is a huge issue. ISR, reconnaissance, all of these technical aspects that the Americans have been supporting with Iraqis with will not be there potentially. And this is where the anxiety comes from. Primarily, there is another issue which some believe, which is that having the Americans there shields Iraq to some extent from Israel. But we've seen in the Gulf that these security guarantees are not necessarily the case.
Right. Let's turn to the question of the Popular Mobilization Forces, or the PMF. The PMF has made headlines over the past few months, both because of a law that the Iraqi parliament wanted to pass that would have made those forces a more permanent force with greater independence within the context of the Iraqi security military complex. And we also had 4 of these groups being designated yesterday by the US government as terrorist organizations. What does the US want to do with the PMF? Washington seems to have taken quite a serious interest in the PMF over the past few months. Does it want PMF to be dissolved entirely, or does it want this force to be reorganized under a new structure with a new mission?
I think the PMF law, and it's good that you raise it, is actually one of the only theaters where we have seen the US focusing on Iraq. It's, the PMF law, and you've seen several correspondence between the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and the Iraqi Prime Minister, Mohammed A on specifically this issue. And the Americans have made it very clear that they are unhappy with the passing of this law. And it's, to be honest, very unlikely that this law will pass until the next government. So it will take some time. What does this law mean? On paper, of course, there are many different interpretations of it, because it's been something that's been developing over the years. Different administrations and different sides have put their parts to it. So it's almost the Frankenstein of a law. But fundamentally, what the theory is the Popular Mobilization Forces are not going anywhere. Despite efforts of integration, despite efforts of creating monopoly over legitimate violence and all of those ideals, the Popular Mobilization Forces are deeply embedded and are part of the Iraqi state already. So this means that the security sector in Iraq will not be just the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Interior, but will also be part of the National Security Council, which include intelligence, which include the security service, and which include the Commission of the Popular Mobilization Forces. Now, some people are concerned that the PMF is such a big force with so many different brigades and groups, and the law governing it is only a few paragraphs long, and there isn't a clear legal structure that defines it. So there is part of the kind of theoretical point is, shouldn't we have a law about this group? Shouldn't we have some idea of what exactly it is, because it's not going anywhere? That's, I'd say, a more optimistic view of the law. There's also those who are concerned with this law because it does give the PMF legal solidification. And at the same time, it gives it significant interest in the Iraqi state and puts it almost in line with the other agencies and parts of the security sector, Ministry of Defense and Interior. It gives it more abilities, technical abilities, and presence in the state. So to answer your question, in short, the law is really enacting what is already de facto present in Iraq, but nonetheless, it is solidifying it.
Right. Well, the PMF, just as you said, has really come to, become this integral component of the Iraqi security military complex. And we have seen these kind of extraordinary measures by the US, such as the, sanctions on some of these groups and the FTO designations of some of them. Would the ongoing US designations and sanctions on the PMF affect Iraq-US military and security relationship, just, due to the fact of how well enshrined and established the PMF is now inside Iraq? How central or important is, in other words, this PMF role within the Iraqi security establishment, and how these sanctions and designations would affect US-Iraqi military and security relationship?
Well, certainly the PMF is not one group, as you know. It's many different groups, some of which are not necessarily sanctioned or part of these designations and are part of the Iraqi government. Others, are sanctioned and have been sanctioned for a long time, and continue to operate in Iraq. I think the fundamental problem with a policy like sanctions is it often seems like whack-a-mole, targeting an individual or a company here or there, but these groups have been proven to be incredibly dynamic. And the reality is, because this is not a legal problem that we're looking at, the way that the Iraqi state and society functions is one that allows for adaptability. So that, even if a group is sanctioned economically, it will be able to find ways and mechanisms to try and overcome that. And we've seen, even with US sanctions on Iran not completely being isolated, but finding different avenues. So, and we even saw sanctions in Iraq in the 1990s, if you want to go very historically, which taught us that when it comes to survival, groups and leaders will find ways around sanctions. So yes, the sanctions, will certainly impact some initial day-to-day of many of these groups and businessmen and brokers who help facilitate some of the economic transactions, but they're not a solution to the fundamental problem of accountability in Iraq. And because of that, I think what we're going to see more and more is that it becomes a whack-a-mole. Will it impact US-Iraq military relations? It's hard to say, because you have two fronts. You have one part of the Trump administration, which is adamant that Iraq is already lost to Iran and its allies, and therefore we need to treat Iraq as a pariah state. But you have other parts of the administration who are more hesitant to go down that line, and who say there are still opportunities in Iraq. And this is a point that the Iraqi government is trying to, push to Washington, which is to say, we know we have some factions, we know we have some resistance groups, which we ourselves are going after. There was a shootout in Baghdad between the Iraqi security forces and Kataib Hezbollah over an employee in the Ministry of Agriculture who was too close to Kataib Hezbollah. So it's an ongoing struggle that Baghdad is also seeking to deal with. and trying to kind of work with the US to some extent on it. So it's hard to say. I think Iraq values its relationship with the US and will not want to, jeopardize that. And I think there are parts of the Trump administration which will continue to want at least American businesses to benefit.
Right. Let's move to the topic of the upcoming parliamentary elections in November, which are very much anticipated. Many see them as fateful, especially in light of the regional developments we have been seeing in the region after October 7th. Some even hope that these elections would lead to a reduction of Iranian influence inside Iraq. How important do you think these elections are going to be? How fateful, or maybe not fateful, they're going to be?
The big story around elections in the last few years in Iraq has been that of turnout. And we've seen a decline in turnout from very high numbers in Iraq's first elections in 2005 to the previous one. There's been a stark decline, which means that many Iraqis are choosing not to vote. They don't believe the system represents them. They don't believe political parties represent them, and they're choosing not to vote. Some polling has come out that suggests perhaps the turnout might go up or not, but we'll have to wait and see. What we think is a continued diminishing of turnout as a younger and expanding young population is left out of the social contract. What elections therefore represent in this type of environment is almost a chance for the political elites to come back together, to go to their social bases first, to get seats, and then to use those seats to renegotiate the state. And so for me, the critical question around what these elections will be and what they, symbolize is in the last few years, we've seen a significant consolidation of power by the Shia coordination framework. There has been more or less a united front that has consolidated power in Baghdad at the behest of those that tried to run the majority government after the last elections. So we've seen a weakening of power in Erbil, a weakening of power with Halbusi and Sunnis, and to some extent, a weakening of power from the Sadrs to some extent. What the elections represent is a potential to rebalance, because we know that Halbusi and other Sunnis will be back with seats, the KDP will be back with seats, the Sadrs will boycott, we could talk about that later, but there will be renewed negotiations, which means that, to me, it's about what the government formation process will actually look like and who will get what out of the ministries and out of the autonomy, and what that means for this current trajectory we see, which is a government run by the Shia coordination framework.
Do you think the rivals of the coordination framework, the Shia coordination framework, are somehow emboldened by the developments in the region and the broader decline of the Iran-led camp in the region since October 7th?
I think, those in the Shia coordination framework are certainly concerned with regional developments. Israel's military superiority and impunity has created significant anxiety. And as well, of course, the weakening of Iran, the perceived weakness of Iran, has presented some opportunity for some of the members to kind of try and break free from Iran's grip, where other members have tried to double down and support Iran's continued adaptability process as it reconstitutes its regional infrastructure. So to answer your question, I think certainly the issue of Iran is central to discussions, but many in the Shia coordination framework seem to be thinking Iraq first. What is best for me in Iraq, the Iraqi state? This is why, even leaders like Qais al-Khazali or Hadi al-Amri, those who people assumed were Iranian proxies, have actually, to some extent, said, has seemed to be focusing more on their government in Iraq and how they can gain as much as possible from the government in Baghdad. And to the extent where they have then had some disputes with Kitab Hezbollah and other resistance groups at times. So it's a very murky and fragmented space. The coordination framework is running on separate ballots, on separate lists, but even Fateh, which used to be the list of all the PMF, has disintegrated as each group runs on its own. So it's incredibly fragmented. The question becomes, after the election, does the coordination framework come back together and form a united front to negotiate vis-a-vis others? Or will their fragmentations, mean a rebalancing of power?
Let's get to the US role after the elections. We know that the government formation process in Iraq usually turns into a saga, that can last about a year. Just for reference, the Kurdistan region does not have a government as of now, almost 1 year after the parliamentary elections. So we also saw that the US didn't really play as much of a strong role after the 2021 elections in terms of shaping the Iraqi government. Should we expect America to play a more active role this time around, especially, just as I said, given the weakening of the Iranian-led access of which some of the groups in Iraq are, considered to be part and parcel?
Yeah, I think both America and Iran, which historically played significant roles in elections and government formations. The second term of Nuri al-Maliki was something that the U.S. government pushed for and Iran pushed for, and that was significant to brokering that second term. But you're right. We've seen in the past both the U.S. and Iran not necessarily get the candidates that they wanted, and not be able to completely, in a hegemonic way, control government formation in Iraq. So I would expect the same. I'm sure the U.S. and Iran would have favorites, would have vetoes, would have people who they certainly don't want to come up. But at the same time, I think the Iraqis, this will be a process that will be dominated by the Iraqi groups.
Right. For my last question, let's talk about the question of who might become the next prime minister of Iraq after the elections. We have seen that the incumbent Prime Minister Mohammed A al-Sudani, he has formed his own political coalition called the Reconstruction and Development Coalition. And so he's going to be one of the major contenders in these upcoming elections. We have also seen after Maliki's second term in 2014 that the figures who have been selected to serve as prime minister have been basically, more or less harmless figures, harmless to the more established and traditional forces and politicians, in the sense that, they don't have a political base of their own. They're not going to pose a threat to other major players in the Iraqi domestic landscape. Should we expect someone new to become the prime minister? Is it going to be Sudani again? Or maybe one of the more established figures such as Maliki, who has not really concealed his ambition and desire to retain the position, to sort of bounce back from the shadows and become the next prime minister?
Yeah, I think both those scenarios are less likely for two main reasons. One, Maliki was the only incumbent to retain a premiership, and certainly since then there has been a very clear preference not for an incumbent to become prime minister, and that rhetoric has already been part of this election cycle, that the incumbent should not. And underlining that is the second point, which is the way that the Iraqi state has been formed, the way the political system has been formed, is for there always to be a weak, sort of harmless, as you say, prime minister in that position. This allows the ruling elites who sit outside the formal government to maintain their own autonomy and their own decision-making power and not have to worry about a government official becoming too powerful. If you look at Iraq, the most powerful figures are not in the government, and that's both in, and that's across the country. So, but particularly in Baghdad. So to answer, the question is always who becomes prime minister, and I think if we're saying their names, they're probably already too much of a threat for them to be accepted. It will most likely be another compromise candidate put there, unless there's a massive crisis or a moment of shock. If things continue as is, it will likely be another leader who is considered a compromise that all of the coordination framework are effectively okay with. We know that, for example, Maliki has a veto against, Sudani, and a few others in the coordination framework have a veto against Sudani. So that would make Sudani's appointment more difficult. And even when we talk about seats, the prime minister will always get seats based on being the prime minister and the coalitions they built. We saw Haider al-Abadi do very well in 2018 when he was prime minister. But those seats can easily disintegrate in the government formation process, which, as you say, is quite lengthy. Is one where you see not just horse trading, but violence used, all sorts of different negotiation tactics used. And at the end, the government will be formed that meets the needs of the system by design.
Thank you so much, Renad. That brings us to the end of today's conversation. It's been a real pleasure having you on the show and hearing your thoughts. Dr. Renad Mansour is the director of the Iraq Initiative at Chatham House and one of the leading voices on Iraqi politics and regional dynamics. And to our listeners, thank you as always for joining us. We will be back in 2 weeks with another episode of GeoSpace.